Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear John, it's great to work with you. I'm proud to be co-host. I'm really happy that Carl and I and our ministries were able to come together and grasp this opportunity to relaunch the Global Strategic Review with the IISS. We think it's a very nice expression of the fact that a lot has happened in this region over the last years in coming even more together than we already were, also when it comes to the outlook on global affairs, global security, global relations. And I should start there just as Carl did. The one part of history that he did not come to was 1905, where we had, of course, a peaceful divorce, which was even more popular in Oslo than in Stockholm, but which also led to a such situation that we are clearly even better friends now than we were before we went into this friendly divorce and became two independent countries. But what is really important for those of you who are not Nordic, not from Norden, as we say, is to understand that for many of us, definitely for me, and I think for a lot of people who come from here, we see the other Nordic countries as something in the middle between domestic and international. We have at home, then we have other Nordic countries, and then we have the world out there. And that is thanks to many decades of systematic integration, beginning with sort of the low and practical level of everyday life. Common labor market long before the EU even was thought about, and long before the EEC started to do it in the European context. The common passports union, common social policies, the sense that you weren't really abroad when we were in a Nordic country, which we now have experienced for generations. The one thing we could not do was common foreign and security policy. Due to obvious reasons, the different choices that we had historically for the long history, the different choices we made when we came out of the Second World War, where Sweden quite logically chose a non-aligned position, having its experience from the Second World War, Norway, Denmark having the experience of being first in war, then occupied, and then part of the liberation of Europe, who chose to become members of NATO. That led to a situation, and Finland with this particular position in the Cold War, led to foreign and security policy being the one theme that we did not really work on together. But when time was ripe, when we understood that the reasons not to do so was gone, and that the reasons to do so actually were available, we really started to build on something that has become very instrumental, very practical, very Nordic in its pragmatic approach, bottom up. We do together what it's useful to do together, and we don't try to do together what is just grand statements and little content. Prior to that, there were attempts to think of the Nordic community as a kind of alternative, that we could do Nordic rather than NATO, Nordic rather than European integration. That, of course, failed at every single moment. It was as long as we thought that the Nordic community was the alternative, we were on the wrong track. It was when we realized that it is a kind of deepening, a more profound integration on top of what we do in the European context, which we all belong to. Either we are members as Finland, Sweden, Denmark, or close partners as Iceland and Norway to the EU, or whether we are members as of NATO as Denmark, Iceland and Norway is, or close partners as Sweden and Finland is, that we can deepen and we can broaden and deepen and make more of what is already there by working together. The key to understand what happened is trust. This was actually something that Karl Deutsch understood already in the 1950s when he wrote about security communities, that more important than institutions and formal stuff is that countries and their societies, people living in countries, develop a level of trust. And he did point at one example of an already established security community in his word, which was precisely the Nordic community. It was a very different interpretation of what we have now. And what is interesting is now that this idea is spreading. We are working closely with our 3 Baltic partners. Much of what we used to do as at 5, as we say here, are now happening at 8. and we are also one of the innovative interventions of this year was Karl and Radek Sikorski, who started something I hope will continue, which is to start to meet as Nordic, Baltic, and Visegrad. So it's a regional approach, not at all trying to build something formal, build something that should substitute anything else that we're part of, but something that can broaden and deepen political integration. And I think it's very much an experience that we both want to continue with and that we want to share with others. The key is to build trust. This is important for those of you who deal in the security and defense field, because we have learned the hard way that smart defense or pooling and sharing, which is exactly the same, but when the EU says it, and when we say it in NATO, it's called smart defense. It's a good idea, but there's no panacea. It doesn't fix things right away. It takes quite a lot of time. It takes quite a lot of effort. It takes quite a lot of deep and complicated decisions and choices, hard choices, priorities. It needs top-down leadership, actually, to push it through. But first and foremost, it needs the existence of trust between states and trust between societies. And that is not easily built, but it can be built, and it has to be built over time. So in that vein, building on what we have done and what we are doing and what we want to continue to do, we thought it was such a great idea to link up with the IISS and also to try to have the Nordic setting, the Swedish-Norwegian setting, alternating, I hope, for many years, although I will not necessarily decide over all these years, alternating between Sweden and Norway. What is clear is next year it will be in Oslo, and we will try to build this into a lasting institution in a very Nordic spirit. Then John has told me that I shall speak about the current state of international relations, and I want to do that very profoundly and without leaving any trace untouched. So in a couple of 3 hours, we will come to dinner. But since I understand that that's not a very popular attitude, I will try to focus on a few observations. One of them is very similar to one of the main themes in Karl's great speech, which is that the world is changing as it always is. You can, at any conference, any given day, you can say that the world is changing, because what will the alternative be? But I think it's fair to say that the changes are both faster and deeper than they have been for many years. We're really in a time of very speedy and significant change to something we don't really have a name for. Most of us have grew up in a Cold War setting, which was relatively easy to grasp. It was bipolar, two major powers, and a lot of international relations were either for real or at least interpreted as a function of the global divide into two. Then we had the 90s and maybe the early years of this millennium, where we were living in some kind of unipolar world. At least there was a perception, and there was quite a lot of reality to it, where the West was on top, we weren't really challenged, and it had a very interesting effect on how we thought about security, we Westerners, how we thought about security, because we perceived that we have a lot of trouble out there. There's a lot of problems, but they always come in the form of asymmetric challenges. We were talking about new threats, and to be honest, we have been talking about exactly the same new threats for 20 years. And I've had some fun in NATO asking my colleagues, how long can the threat claim to be a new threat? And how many decades does it remain new? Because I think what we are, embarking on is an understanding that while the asymmetric threats are going to stay with us for the foreseeable future, they may not be the only ones. There may be other states out there who are building significant capacity for strategically challenging us, which is not Al-Qaeda, not the Taliban, not international terrorism, not even just cyber threats, however profoundly relevant and important and difficult those are to deal with, as we have seen over the last years. But there's also a possibility that there will be a strategic challenge. There's somebody else out there, not adversaries, not necessarily enemies, not necessarily even opponents, but somebody else who are also setting the scene. And this means that we have to relearn or reinterpret some of what we used to think about, but in a very, very different setting. I think that's important to think about. We went from something which could maybe be called bipolar to something we could possibly call unipolar to something we don't know. Is it multipolar? Is it non-polar, zero-polar? I will opt for something closer to non-polar than multipolar at the time. And I think one of the reasons that John is right in describing this kind of anarchy is that while the old managers of the system are kind of stepping down from that plight or obligation or claim, others are not necessarily filling in. So we're seeing key players in the world who are basically in it for themselves and not necessarily carriers of the system. This will probably change. I think it has to change, but it needs a kind of different global dialogue. And where do we see the expression of that? We can see it in, of course, in the security field, which brings a lot of us together, but it's clearly also true for the World Trade Organization. Why do we have a problem in the World Trade Organization? Well, one reason is that some of the new kids on the block, the new dominant powers, haven't really learned to live with the fact that they are the new kids on the block and relevant, nor have some of the older powers really understood that their position is different than it used to be, and that's an important challenge for both, and for the rest of us who are not that big. Same thing in the global climate negotiations. Everybody knows it's important, but how do we move from a sense of trying to find out how we just put rules on limiting our right to pollute and transform that into a kind of global focus, not only on climate, but also how we find the good intersection between energy and climate. And the energy theme is fundamental in many ways, both the access to energy, but also the changing geopolitics of energy, or the changing geo-energy landscape, which is developing so fast that the books we read or even wrote a couple of years ago are already obsolete. Because it's a fundamental, the fact that North America is becoming a net exporter of fossil fuel, and that America is almost about to live up to the Kyoto obligations it never accepted, is a fundamental change. And what does it mean? What does it mean for the Arab world? What does it mean for the relations between the West and the Arab world? And what does it mean for the relationship between the new consumers, China, India and company, and the Arab world, for instance? These are deep and fundamental questions that we have to understand. Another point I wanted to bring up for here, which is another sort of macro observation, a suggestion from my side, is that we are always, particularly those of us who believe in global order and some kind of global institutions, we are typically looking for the phenomenon of globalization and for global institutions to meet the challenge. I think we still should, but I think that much of the dynamics that we're seeing now in the world are rather regional. It's rather an expression of regionalization than of globalization. And I mean that on two levels. One is the economic relationships. When India says look east, it's because they understand that they can't necessarily depend just on exporting to markets used to demand more than they do today. They have to work in the region. I spoke to the African Union's Commissioner on Trade and asked her if she could only give me one answer. What is most important between opening the access to other markets versus promoting intra-African trade? And she said, without any hesitation, intra-African trade is where we're heading now. And I think you see the same thing in Latin America and many other regions. So there's an economic regional dynamic, but also a political dynamic in some regions. And the most failed region, the region that clearly works least well, to put it mildly, is of course the Middle East. And Carl talked about the drama of the absence of some kind of organizing principle. What we're actually seeing now is a war in Syria that is much more than a civil war in Syria. It's sort of the big war about the future of the Middle East, and a lot of players are involved, particularly those from the region and a lot of others, and it's deeply dramatic, and I don't think anybody knows what to do about that. I should also add, since I got the cue from Carl, that Israel-Palestine, since that's something I work particularly much on, as the chair of the International Donors Group for the Palestinian state building, and we have a big important meeting next week in New York to try to support and underpin the work that John Kerry is doing with a lot of vigor in trying to, we did get the parties, the Israelis and the Palestinians, to meet, and we try to see how can we build the economic underpinning on that political project even further. And I've said, just as Carl said, as the chair, I've been saying, and this is a dramatic statement for somebody coming from a country where Oslo is the capital, but also the name of the peace process in the Middle East, this is the last chance. I'm quite optimistic they will pick this last chance. Actually, it looks better. I had the strange experience, first time for many years in visiting Ramallah and Jerusalem only 3 weeks ago, leaving more optimistic than I arrived. That's the first time, I think, because normally it's the other way around. But the fact that the parties are talking, and they are also understanding that the alternative to success is not status quo, but something clearly worse than status quo, seems to have inspired some sense of urgency. Whether it's enough, we don't know. We'll see, but we have a kind of 9-month horizon to see if that works. But another extremely interesting observation from that trip, which really struck me, is that when I talked to the presidents of both countries, or the key leaders, prime minister, strategists, military, all around, and about how do you see the regional picture, they were extremely, surprisingly similar. The Palestinians and the Israelis had very similar analysis of Egypt. Probably rather positive to the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood was not any longer in power. So among us, I think we have some observations about how political change should happen and should not happen, but this is not the point right here. The point is that that has sort of created a different strategic surrounding in the south for the West Bank Palestinians and for Israel, the Israeli government. They had a very similar analysis of Syria and a very similar analysis of Lebanon and Jordan and so on. I was trying to encourage them that if you actually agree on other things, why not try to agree on your own issue? Because this is the small piece of land. So the strip of very few people, very small land, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, is the part of the Middle East which is not in flames. And you could either try to keep it that way together, or you will be drawn into the geopolitical nightmare that's happening around this region. But elsewhere, we see fantastic progress. We see, I skimmed through the report and I thought it was great. I really recommend it. But I will take issue with your text on ASEAN. It was right for last year. But I was present at the July meeting of the ASEAN, Southeast Asian Nations ministerial meeting. They all felt, and I was not there last year, it was a much better meeting than last year. The relationship to China has clearly improved, so everybody told me. They are now dealing with code of conduct for maritime issues together. It's a long way to go, but there is something happening where you're actually doing what countries should do, transforming a deep problem to trying to some kind of addressing it together. That's interesting. And we had we have a regional dynamic, but we also see intra-regional relationships. And just two fresh examples. Carl and I was in a hut in Kiruna in northern Sweden. Very nice place, had excellent reindeer food. With the 6 other ministers of the 8 Arctic Council nations. And we had a discussion, which was, an absolutely open discussion when we went into the room, whether we should open up for new observers. There were a number of candidates, not particularly insignificant countries, namely China, India, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Italy, and the European Union. And they wanted to be observers to all little club up in the north. And they were desperate to get in. There was really a strong interest in taking part of this Arctic adventure that we've been working a lot on. And Carl was the outgoing chair and ably led that meeting. Maybe I should say, to our surprise, we made it. There was a qualification on the EU. We're working to fix that. But the others were allowed in as observers. And 1.5 months later, I was personally signing Norway's accession to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia. Now, that's not obvious that Norway should be a part of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia. But given that we have a global outreach and are thinking broad terms and long term, we thought that was useful. And that also suggests that these regional dynamics are not only for the region itself, but a kind of inter-regional, intra- and inter-regional dynamics that are coming relevant and important. And that takes me back to where I started. We are seeing a Europe that is hopefully and probably about to start a long journey of coming out of the crisis. It's incredibly important for everyone. My issue with Europe as a close partner on the outside, Norway, as you know, is the country in the world that is most a member of the EU without being a member in the EU. It's almost like Sweden and NATO, you know. We do everything like they do as long as we don't have to make decisions in Brussels. That's our shared attitude to respect the EU and NATO. But that's crucially important. But it had also meant that for a couple of years, this sort of the grand ideas of a very clear European voice on the global scene has not been there. It's not a critique of any individuals. It's just a function of the fact that so much of the work had to be, so much of the energy went into how to save oneself. And that's good for all of us because, you know, a collapsing Europe will be a deep tragedy for the world. De-integration would look really nasty in all possible terms, economic, but also political trust going down, and even worse things could happen if we started on that. NATO, extremely important for us as a founding father of NATO, is also going through a very interesting transformation, to put it that way, to try to reinvent itself as a post-operational alliance. Not that, I mean, I'm not suggesting that we won't do operations anymore. What I'm just saying is my observation, having followed NATO both as defense minister and foreign minister and for many years before that, is that NATO, you know, a NATO ministerial meeting or a summit for just 3 years ago would be 90% about the operation of the day. That would be Afghanistan, 10 years earlier, K4 or S4. Today, that's not the main issue. It's who are we? What are we for? What is the core business? What is the purpose of the alliance? And how do we get it right when it comes to smart defense and getting these things to work together? And in that picture, I land where I started. You know, the Nordic cooperation, we do think that we have, I mean, we have definitely not answers to everything. A lot of people in the Nordic community used to think that we have answers to everybody else's problem, and beware of those, because those answers are not always relevant. But we have some experiences that we have been making over these years that we're happy to share and to use this platform, and that is very much about how deep integration should be multi-level. It should be, when possible, bottom-up. It should be practical, but it also requires a strong vision and a strong desire and a strong instinct saying that we are able to do more when we do it together than we do it each on our own. That's actually a strategic approach to international relations, and I think I will leave it with that, and that also means that you are very close now to getting your dinner. Thank you for the attention.